I'm Robin Shuckburgh, welcoming you to the Cotswold Explorer Halloween Livestream 2023. We're starting this evening with haunted stories from the Cotswolds. A couple of these you might have seen before, but many of them you won't. And we start with one that has to do with my family, slightly outside the Cotswolds themselves. We've been to many places in the past, from the sprawling settlements of Cheltenham, Gloucester and Cirencester, to the picture postcard locations of Stow-on-the-Wold, Burford and Broadway. We've discovered ghost stories of all kinds, from phantom boats and flying monks to demonic chariots and moving stones. This evening, we'll be taking you on another tour with even more spine-chilling tales, from the heights of Edge Hill at the northern tip of the region, right down to the city of Bath at the southern frontier of the Cotswold Ridge. Come with me if you dare. Now, some of you watching may be concerned that this is simply a repeat of the haunted programme we uploaded earlier in October, but I can reassure you that on this live stream we are throwing in several new stories along the way. We couldn't resist including this little tale. It appears there is a ghost involving my own family, even if it does take us slightly outside the Cotswolds. One of my ancestors was knighted by King Charles I before the Battle of Edge Hill, and his home, called Shuckburgh, is less than 20 miles north of Edge Hill in Warwickshire. At Shuckburgh, possibly in the 18th century, Sir Stukely Shuckburgh, Bart, deemed a certain Lieutenant Sharp not worthy of courting his daughter. We are told that this pushed Sharp over the edge, and that he shot Shuckburgh's daughter before turning the gun on himself. Ever since, ghostly figures have been reported wandering the corridors of what is now called Shuckburgh Hall. And it's difficult to pinpoint their identity, so it's unclear whether it is Sharp, the Shuckburgh daughter, or both. Whether this horror actually took place in my family's history, I'm not sure. It's certainly the first time I've heard the tale. But congratulations to Ross for discovering it. It's certainly spooky. I do remember when staying at Shuckburgh as a small child, finding the place more than a little scary. Very dark, cold rooms and lots of unexplained noises. In my bedroom, there was a tapestry on the wall, and I noticed the skeletal head of a blackbird poking out from the material. It had obviously got trapped somehow behind the tapestry and died trying to escape. No one, it seems, had thought it worth bothering to remove the corpse. I wonder if it's changed much since then. Probably not. Perhaps we should go and see one day. We start this evening in a small village of Edge Hill, at the very northern tip of the Cotswolds. This place is highly significant because just behind me is the field of the first pitched battle of the English Civil War. On the 23rd of October 1642, as King Charles I marched with his army towards London with the intention of taking and occupying the capital, Essex, in command of the Parliamentary Army, moved to intercept him. It was obvious that a confrontation was inevitable, and the two armies, neither of them very experienced, formed their lines against one another and prepared for battle. After a brief exchange of artillery fire, noisy but fairly ineffectual, battle was joined. Prince Rupert, the king's nephew, and in command of the cavalry, successfully drove the opposing horsemen from the battlefield. Unfortunately, he then allowed his soldiers to loot and plunder the parliamentarians' baggage train in Kinnerton, rather than rejoin the battle. The king, for some while without his cavalry, lost his advantage, and despite the eventual return of Rupert's horsemen, the battle ended without a decisive result. The following day, the exhausted armies retreated, the king to Oxford and the parliamentarians to London to fortify the city against any further attack. It wasn't until some months later that the events of Edge Hill returned literally to haunt the king. The story goes that he'd heard rumours of terrible apparitions in the sky. So convincing were these stories that he commissioned a report. When it came, this is what it said. On Saturday, which was in Christmas time, between 12 and 1 o'clock in the morning, was heard by some shepherds first the sound of drums afar off, and the noise of soldiers giving out their last groans, at which they were much amazed, and amazed stood still, until it seemed the noise did approach them closely, at which point, too much affrighted, they sought to withdraw as fast as possibly they could. Then the most incredible vision filled the sky. Strange and portentous apparitions of two jarring and contrary armies. The same incorporeal soldiers that had made those clamours, the clattering of arms, noise of cannons, ensigns displayed, drums beating, muskets going off, cannons discharged, horses neighing, cries of soldiers, and the two armies pell-mell to it they went. So amazing and terrifying the poor men that they could not believe they were mortal, or give credit to their eyes and ears. Run away they durst not, for fear of being made a prey to these infernal soldiers. And so they, with much fear and affright, stayed to behold the success of the business. The following night, all the substantial inhabitants of that and the neighbouring parishes drew hither, where, about half an hour after their arrival, on Sunday, being Christmas night, appeared in the same tumultuous warlike manner the same two adverse armies, fighting with as much spite and spleen as formerly. And so departed the gentlemen and all the spectators, much terrified with these visions of horror, withdrew themselves to their houses, beseeching God to defend them from these hellish and prodigious enemies. King Charles's commissioners, that had been dispatched directly to Kinnerton to report on these stories, actually witnessed the phenomenon for themselves. They went as far as to say they recognized officers partaking in the battle, men they knew to have been killed there. They concluded that these strange events were the result of God's anger at the dreadful situation the country found itself in. The locals believed it was because so many of the dead bodies after the battle had not been buried, so they took it upon themselves to give each and every corpse a proper burial. Not long after this, the extraordinary aerial haunting came to an end, and the peaceful lives of the residents of the nearby villages returned to normal. Some claim, however, that each year, on the night of the 23rd of October, you can still see a faint ghostly reenactment of the first terrible battle of the English Civil War. As we travel down to Chipping Norton, a quick detour towards Shipton-on-Stour reveals a ghost that's been seen crossing the B4086 in front of heavy traffic before disappearing through a brick wall. It's thought this might be the ghost of a farmer who was killed in an accident on this spot many years before. Unfortunately, the details of the accident are pretty vague. We come across a similar story in Hook Norton, not far away, where the ghost of a man standing in the Milcombe Road has been spotted. One driver reported seeing the figure slamming his brakes on, anticipating the inevitable thud, only to look up and find that the man had completely disappeared. There was once a local man of Hook Norton who was known to walk to Bloxham and back every day. Could it have been his spirit retracing his steps? At the Salfords and Lincoln Inn in the village, a ghostly figure has been spotted. It was seen by a previous owner walking across the bedroom to a cot, where it bent down as if inspecting the sleeping child, and leaving the room as quickly as it had appeared. The inn backs onto a graveyard, and in the garden the owner described a cold, foreboding atmosphere that would discourage him and his dog from venturing out there. We head south now to Chipping Norton, to the Church of St. Mary the Virgin. This lovely old building originates largely from the 12th century, but our ghost story seems to have happened in the year 1549. The country was suffering an economic decline at the hands of Edward VI, Lord Protector Edward Seymour, which prompted a reaction from the people, referred to later as the Oxfordshire Rising. Legislation leading to the enclosure of public land and amendments to the Anglican Church by the introduction of the new Book of Common Prayer fanned the flames, and before long a rebellion was gathering momentum. The vicar of St. Mary's, Chipping Norton, Henry Joyce, joined the rising, apparently because the Chantries Act had left him more than 800 parishioners to minister for entirely on his own. In mid-July, a mercenary force of German and Swiss soldiers under the command of William Grey, 13th Baron Grey de Wilton, were dispatched to extinguish this resistance, and the mob was dispersed at Enslow Hill. Around 200 people were taken prisoner, including the ringleaders, one of whom was Henry Joyce. It was decided to make an example of these ringleaders, and they were returned to their respective towns to be executed publicly on market day. Their heads were to be set at the highest point available for the more terror of the said evil people. And so Henry Joyce was strung in chains from the church tower in Chipping Norton, a deterrent to the other rebels. Joyce's ghost has been witnessed many times, haunting the site of his execution. We are now on our way to Woodstock, and along the way we pass Lynham Longbarrow, from where we hear a truly peculiar story. One pitch-dark night, a man was walking home from Chipping Norton to Burford. As he was passing the Longbarrow, he felt, rather than saw, another man come up alongside him. They walked and talked together, covering some distance until they passed a cottage, where a woman stood outside carrying a lantern. Grabbing the opportunity to see his travelling companion in the light, our hero glanced round, only to find, to his astonishment, that his fellow walker was carrying his own head under his arm. As soon as the headless figure realized he'd been spotted, he vanished into thin air. Let's now take a brief detour down Pudlicote Lane. Here a legend tells of an old lady known by all as Gran, who was believed to live in a cave at the nearby quarry. Despite her humble and unorthodox accommodation, it was said she possessed a hoard of gold sovereigns, buried somewhere in the quarry. A ghostly figure has been spotted many times at the road junction. Now known as the White Lady, she is believed to be Gran, searching for her stash of gold. we now visit Woodstock. The Bear Hotel behind me in the town centre started as a 13th century coaching inn, so it's no surprise that the building has some haunting stories. Room 16 in particular has been associated with supernatural manifestations. One story recounts how a noble woman, pregnant with an illegitimate child, was travelling to Scotland, where her giving birth could be kept a secret and the child could be adopted. Unfortunately, having stopped at the Bear Inn, and while staying in room 16, she gave birth prematurely, and the child was tragically lost. Future guests in the room report hearing the sound of a crying baby, despite no baby staying anywhere in the hotel. A phantom lady has also been spotted drifting down the hotel's corridors, as if searching for her crying child. However, in the 16th century, a woman was strangled in the hotel, and some think that the ghost could be this unfortunate woman. Otherwise, ghostly footsteps have been heard, and some say with absolute conviction that the hotel is haunted by the ghost of a workman who fell from the roof and died over 3 centuries ago. On the edge of the village stands the huge and grandiose palace of Blenheim, built for John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, over many years from 1705, in the centre of a royal manor and park, given to Marlborough as a reward for his victory over the French at the Battle of Blenheim. There was a fine old house on the estate before the palace was built, in which, in the mid-17th century, poltergeist activity was extremely disruptive. During the English Civil War in 1649, it was captured by the parliamentarians, who, knowing how much it was valued by the king as a hunting estate, wasted no time in converting Charles's bedroom into a kitchen and the royalist council rooms into a brewery. But it was after they cut down an old tree known as the King's Oak that the onslaught of poltergeist activity began. On a dark night in 1649, an unidentifiable animal was spotted entering the manor, and shortly afterwards, firewood cut from the King's Oak was found all over the house. Over the next 3 weeks, furniture was overturned, beds were disturbed, candles were blown out, and objects were hurled about the place in a flurry of activity. This culminated in the shaking of walls and the smashing of windows, as well as loud, dismal thunderings echoing around the manor. The occupying parliamentarians were so terrified by all of this that they fled the manor for more peaceful lodgings in the town. Whether it was really a ghost, or perhaps the pranks and harassment of locals loyal to the king, we'll never be quite sure. We turn west now, taking the road between Charlbury and Finstock. This route is said to be haunted by a phantom coach and four. Usually, only the sounds of horses' hooves and clattering wheels can be heard, roughly following the route of the B4022. It sometimes deviates from the road, probably because modern alterations have changed the road's course over the years. On one occasion, a party from Charlbury, attempting to get to the bottom of this phenomenon, decided to block the ghostly coach by barricading the road. They waited for some time before the unmistakable cacophony of the coach approached, but they saw nothing. To their astonishment, they heard the coach stop abruptly, pause briefly as if in consideration, and then they heard the sound of it turning around and setting off back for Charlbury. Triumphant that their experiment had worked, the party removed the barricade. But their satisfaction was short-lived, for as they were packing away the last remnants of the barricade, the unmistakable sound of the coach came clattering back down the road, passed by them, and carried on towards Finstock. Another account tells of a mother and son out walking when they heard the infamous sound approach. They paused to let the phantom pass, but to the mother's surprise, the sound of the coach slowed and stopped. Her son pointed in the direction of the noises and said, "That lady in the carriage wants me to go over to her." The mother could only see her son pointing into thin air, but she was able to hear the sound of hooves stamping on the road. The boy, entirely unfazed, started towards the coach, but his mother grabbed his hand before he could walk into the road. Shortly afterwards, she heard the sound of the coach pulling away and receding into the distance across the River Evenlode. The child was able to give a surprisingly detailed description of what he'd witnessed. There was a green carriage driven by two men in hats, and a woman inside with a black jacket, white blouse and a hat with feathers in it. She looked upset, as if she'd been crying, and had beckoned the boy into the coach. Her expression had become angry when the boy's mother stopped him from going to her. What, one wonders, would have happened if the boy had not been stopped by his mother? It seems the roads around Finstock have a large number of supernatural phenomena. If we were to follow the phantom coach further down the road, we find local reports of a ghostly white stallion riding towards Ramsden. Is it possible that this is connected in some way to the story just a few miles back? Not far away, another phantom horse and carriage has been seen in Wilcote. If it's the same haunting, then it could be attributed to Sir William and Lady Wilcote, who owned the manor at Wilcote in the 14th century. Like Lord and Lady Tanfield in Burford, they were at odds with the locals during their lives, and have featured in various haunting stories after their deaths. They've been seen riding up and down the avenue in front of Wilcote House in a coach and four. On some occasions it's been spotted flying through the sky above Wilcote and over their graves at North Lee. We covered this story in slightly more detail in our Ghostly Trails of Oxfordshire series over on our sister channel. But for now, we're sticking more strictly to the Cotswolds. Moving west, we take the A40 trunk road towards Burford. Before this dual carriageway was built, the main road between Witney and Burford was the B4047. It's along this stretch of road near Astle that a ghostly highwayman has been spotted, nicknamed Blackstockings by the locals. He's been seen on both horseback and on foot, and one theory suggests he is one of the Tom, Dick and Harry Dunstan brothers, infamous highwaymen, well known for targeting Burford in their notorious robberies. The beautiful village of Astle has a particularly strange story involving the ghost of a hitchhiker. Two separate accounts detail two people that met a gypsy-like girl on the road near Astle Manor. On a dark October evening, a driver passing through the village spotted a girl with dark shoulder-length hair, olive skin, and a gypsy-like appearance, who flagged him down, climbed into the passenger seat, and sat in silence. The driver told of how the girl was soaked through, and when he asked her if she was all right, she replied, "It's too late, he's gone," before vanishing before the driver's eyes. On the second occasion, on an afternoon in March, when a young mother was on her way to collect her son from school, she saw a young girl trying to flag her down. She stopped and let her in. As the young, drenched girl climbed in, she said, "You got my message then?" The driver asked what the girl meant, and she answered, "The water, the river, he's gone," and again vanished. No one seems to have found any explanation for these peculiar encounters. Nobody has managed to connect the phenomena to any real-world events. The girl's soaked condition and her mention of the river could indicate some tragedy at the nearby River Windrush, but there is no further information to go on. Continuing on, fortunately with no phantom hitchhiker in tow, we pass through Swinbrook. The bridge that crosses the River Windrush here is said to be haunted by the ghost of a woman in 15th century clothes, carrying a bundle. She looks frail and distressed as she crosses the bridge, pausing in the middle before vanishing into thin air. Now we will revisit Burford. Those of you who watched our first ever Halloween special may remember we told you the famous ghost story of the Tanfield family. Many years ago, a Reverend George W. Underwood had just moved in to begin his tenure at the beautiful church of St. John the Baptist. His wife was upstairs one day in the rectory when a visitor arrived. The guest was shown into the drawing room by a servant, who then went upstairs to inform Mrs. Underwood that she had a guest. When she came downstairs, the drawing room was empty. She looked around the rest of the house and garden and found nothing. The visitor had vanished. Mrs. Underwood's servant described the woman as wearing a brown dress with a peculiar, somewhat forbidding face. Friends of the Underwoods, after hearing this description, realized that it matched the description of a Mrs. Thorpe, the wife of a previous vicar, Reverend John Thorpe. Mrs. Underwood's mind, whilst confused, at least was put at rest, until it was explained that Mrs. Thorpe was not only long dead, but that she had a sinister reputation. It seems some children under her care had gone missing in extremely mysterious circumstances. Could the ghost of Mrs. Thorpe have returned to the scene of her crimes? The former George Inn, now an antique shop, is also said to be haunted by the trio of highwaymen we met earlier, Tom, Dick and Harry Dunstan. It was here they would often meet to plan their crimes of highway robbery and burglary. Dick went missing and was never seen again after a bungled robbery, after which Tom and Harry were forced to amputate his arm. He was assumed to be dead. These latter two brothers were caught, sent for trial, and executed in Gloucester, before their bodies were transported back to Oxfordshire to be displayed as a deterrent for other footpads. On the journey, the man transporting the bodies stopped at the George Inn for a drink. Is it possible he knew this was their favourite drinking spot? We'll probably never know, but strange noises have been heard in the passages of the building, and dogs are said to growl as if watching someone or something that is invisible to the human eye. Just before we start our journey south, we'll move northwest a little, to a famous village on the Fosse Way. It is perhaps the most famous tourist destination in the entire Cotswolds, Wotton on the Water. Here we have just two brief ghost stories. The first is from the 1990s, where three men were driving into the village just as dusk was falling. They noticed in the rearview mirror a motorbike and sidecar driving close behind them. It followed them for some distance, and as they approached the village and the sun sunk below the horizon, the bike mysteriously vanished into thin air. The second, slightly more amusing tale is that of a practical, joking, ghostly brick. In one of Bolton's many lovely tea houses, people have reported stubbing their toe and tripping over something that feels like a brick protruding from the ground, only to look down and find nothing there. There are other more sinister tales of murder and witchcraft in this village, but we'll save those for another time. We're moving south now, passing through North Leach, where the Wheatsheaf Inn is said to be haunted by a ghostly child. Guests have reported hearing footsteps rushing around in the dead of night, and lights coming on despite no one being around to flip the switch. We're on our way to the world-famous tourist destination of Bibury, described by William Morris as the most beautiful village in England. Even the most beautiful of places can be home to a ghost story or two. Legend has it that many years ago a wealthy man moved to Bibury to take stewardship of the mill. As a recent widow with 3 grown-up sons, he was on the lookout for a new wife, and found one in a young lady called Mary, who was reluctant to marry him, but it was difficult for her to refuse the wealth or the position the marriage would give her in the village. So they settled into married life in Bibury. He was a busy man and often away on business, leaving home for long periods of time. But when he came home one evening, he discovered, to his horror, his eldest son in bed with his wife, Mary. In a fit of rage, he threw his son into the mill pond, where he drowned, and then he locked Mary out of the house to teach her a strong lesson. The following morning, when he went in search of his wife, he found her frozen to death at the side of the pool. It is said that every now and again on cold wintry mornings in Bibury, Mary still haunts the village lanes. There are rumours of other ghosts here too, a spectral cat in the Swan Hotel, and phantom faces pressing at the windows of the mill, observed from the street in the dead of night. If you're enjoying our videos, be sure to subscribe to the channel and follow us on Instagram at the Cotswold Explorer for behind-the-scenes access. You can find many more ghost stories read by me by following the link in the description. And if you simply can't get enough of our Halloween specials, our sister channel has you covered. Head over to Horrific Tales and Ghostly Trails, where a whole team of us are embarking on the telling of supernatural stories across the country. We move southwest now, down to Wotton under Edge, where the Ram Inn is widely regarded as one of the most infamously haunted buildings in the entire country. Built on the site of a pagan burial ground from over 5,000 years ago, one of the earliest legends of the Ram stems from a story that a witch was burned at the stake here in the 1500s. She was sentenced to death for not practicing Christianity, and one of the rooms in the inn is known as the Witch's Room. Ever since, her troubled spirit has haunted the building. Poltergeist activity has been reported here, including shaking beds and tables, and chairs flinging themselves across the room. Apparitions of monks, a cavalier, a beautiful young woman, and even a cat have been witnessed amongst the twisting corridors and oppressive atmosphere of this ancient building. But why have so many spectres been spotted here? One explanation suggests that the redirection of a natural water supply to the ancient Ram opened up a portal of dark energy. John Humphreys, the previous owner during the 20th century, attested to this, claiming that he'd been grabbed and dragged across the room by some kind of demonic force. He later found skeletal remains of children under the staircase, with broken daggers lying within the bones. Evidence perhaps of devil worship and ritual sacrifice? We're moving south now to the picture postcard village of Castle Combe. This village is a famous centre of Cotswold tourism and has some ghostly goings-on. In the graveyard of St. Andrews, the apparition of a young, pale girl has been seen wandering solemnly around the gravestones. A ghostly miller has also been spotted hurrying across the brook at the bottom of the village towards the miller's cottages, covered in white flour. But it is up in Parsonage Woods that the most frequently related haunting can be found. People have reported voices accompanying them as they trek up to the woodland after dark, stopping as soon as you pause or look behind you. Many have heard moans coming from amongst the trees, which stops abruptly after a monstrous scream pierces the night. Some have suggested it is the recreation of a battle between Saxons and Vikings taking place here, but there is no historical record to back this up. Others have said the noises can be attributed to ancient pagan ceremonies and devil worship. And another theory points to the Romans. Before the castle was built after which the village Castle Combe was named, a Roman villa stood nearby. When you visited this 5th century villa, as you walk down through Parsonage Woods back into the village, you may bump into the village's most famous ghost, a Roman centurion standing guard over a bridge across the brook, apparently left behind after the great legions of Rome left the country. A place as beautiful as this easily fires up the imagination, and one could easily see how paranormal stories have taken hold here. With the Roman centurion on our mind, we journey now to the final destination in tonight's ghostly trail, at the southern tip of the Cotswold Ridge, the city of Bath. In the 18th century, it saw a careful expansion that saw buildings in a neoclassical style harmoniously in keeping with the Roman vernacular. Two such buildings are the Garrick's Head and the Theatre Royal, which are to be our first destination here. One ghost takes the form of a spectral butterfly, which reportedly flits around the theatre every Christmas morning. Another is the Grey Lady, a term we're used to hearing when listening to stories of female ghosts. It is said that this Grey Lady was a young actress who, despite being married, had an affair with a handsome leading man. Furious upon discovering her infidelity, her husband challenged the leading man to a pistol duel. To the young lady's horror, after blinding flashes and the thunderous sound of pistol shots, her young actor-lover lay dead at her feet. Totally distraught, she fled to the Garrick's Head, where, well, reports vary, but she either flung herself from one of the top-floor windows or hanged herself, depending on whom you believe. The most notable clue that connects this young actress to the spectral Grey Lady is the feathered wrap she wore during her final performance before ending her life. Those who have encountered the ghost have said that the delicate scent of jasmine wafts from her, and they do tell that if you look closely, you can make out the feathered wrap against her shady figure. Another chilling apparition was experienced many years ago by a theatre employee. As he was locking up for the night and walking down the corridor that led to the stalls, a poster for a play that one of his friends had starred in caught his eye. Pausing to check the billing and the name, he became aware of a presence behind him as a prickling sensation and swept across his back. Pausing to check the billing and the name, he became aware of a presence behind him as a prickling sensation swept across his back. On turning around to confront whatever this was, he was confronted by a demonic face atop a dark figure, evidently formed of billowing black smoke, swirling around as if trying to solidify into something less spectral. The man immediately ran to find a colleague who suggested it was just an hallucination. perhaps as a result of a few too many beers. A short time later, however, this same colleague was in the same corridor when he experienced exactly the same apparition. What could it have been? We find another haunted hostelry in the Royal Crescent. Built in the late 1700s and a truly remarkable piece of Georgian architecture, the Crescent is a Grade 1 listed building, and it's not really surprising that it has a resident ghost. Several people have witnessed a phantom horse-drawn carriage pulling up majestically outside as if to collect or receive an important guest. From inside, others have heard a lady singing from a far-off room. On Bennett Street, one of the most famous sightings is that of a man in the hat. This curious figure is thought to be Admiral Arthur Phillip, a Royal Navy officer who died in 1814 at his home at number 19. A lady who lived there more recently said she frequently saw his ghost, and her maid one day rushed to her, exclaiming that she'd seen a very extravagantly dressed man on the stairs. The lady then pointed at the mantelpiece, where a small painting of the Admiral hung, wearing the same clothes the servant girl had described. On one occasion he was seen sitting in front of the fire, and when spoken to, faded away to nothing. He's been seen outside too, said to appear as a slightly hunched figure wearing a black robe and large black hat, wandering with a rocking sailor's gait around the assembly rooms not far from his home. There are many other ghost stories to tell in Bath's surrounding towns and villages, and we will return another time. But meanwhile, come and see for yourselves. Here ends tonight's ghostly trail of the Cotswolds. If you've only just discovered us and enjoyed tonight's tour, there are 2 more Halloween episodes in the channel for you to enjoy. And be sure to press the subscribe button and the little bell icon so we can keep you informed of all future videos. You can find everything else we do by visiting our website, thecotswoldexplorer.co.uk, and if you want to be kept up to date, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at The Cotswold Explorer. A whole team of presenters, including me, can be found covering supernatural stories beyond the Cotswolds on our sister channel, Horrific Tales and Ghostly Trails. So head over there if you've enjoyed this video. Happy Halloween, and we'll see you again somewhere in the Cotswolds very soon. I hope you enjoyed our little ghost stories. I'll read you another story. It's called Ancient Lights by Algernon Blackwood. Ancient Lights by Algernon Blackwood. From Southwater, where he left the train, the road led due west. That he knew. For the rest he trusted to luck, being one of those born walkers who dislike asking the way. He had that instinct, and as a rule it served him well. A mile or so due west along the sandy road till you come to a stile on the right, then across the fields you'll see the red house straight before you. He glanced at the postcard's instructions once again, and once again he tried to decipher the scratched-out sentence, without success. It had been so elaborately inked over that no word was legible. Inked-out sentences in a letter were always enticing. He wondered what it was that had to be so very carefully obliterated. The afternoon was boisterous, with a tearing, shouting wind that blew from the sea across the Sussex Weald. Massive clouds with rounded, piled-up edges cannoned across the gaping spaces of blue sky. Far away, the line of downs swept the horizon like an arriving wave. Chanctonbury Ring rode their crest, a scudding ship howled down before the wind. He took his hat off and walked rapidly, breathing great draughts of air with delight and exhilaration. The road was deserted, no horsemen, bicycles or motors, not even a tradesman's cart, no single walker. But anyhow, he would never have asked the way. Keeping a sharp eye for the stile, he pounded along while the wind tossed the cloak against his face and made waves across the blue puddles in the yellow road. The trees showed their underleaves of white. The bracken and the high new grass bent all one way. Great life was in the day, high spirits and dancing everywhere. And for a Croydon surveyor's clerk just out of an office, this was like a holiday at the sea. It was a day for high adventure, and his heart rose up to meet the mood of nature. His umbrella with the silver ring ought to have been a sword, and his brown shoes should have been top boots with spurs upon the heels. Where hid the enchanted castle and the princess with the hair of sunny gold? His horse... The stile came suddenly into view and nipped adventure in the bud. Everyday clothes took him prisoner again. He was a surveyor's clerk, middle-aged, earning £3 a week, coming from Croydon to see about a client's proposed alterations in a wood. Something to ensure a better view from the dining-room window. Across the fields, perhaps a mile away, he saw the red house gleaming in the sunshine, and resting on the stile a moment to get his breath, he noticed a copse of oak and hornbeam on the right. "Aha," he told himself, "so that must be the wood he wants to cut down to improve the view. I'll have a look at it." There were boards up, of course, but there was an inviting little path as well. "I'm not a trespasser," he said. "It's part of my business, this is." He scrambled awkwardly over the gate and entered the copse. A little round would bring him to the field again. But the moment he passed among the trees, the wind ceased to shout, and a stillness dropped upon the world. So dense was the growth that the sunshine only came through in isolated patches. The air was close. He mopped his forehead and put his green felt hat on, but a low branch knocked it off again at once, and as he stooped, an elastic twig swung back and stung his face. There were flowers along both edges of the little path. Glades opened on either side. Ferns curved about in damper corners, and the smell of earth and foliage was rich and sweet. It was cooler here. What an enchanting little wood, he thought, turning down a small green glade where the sunshine flickered like silver wings. How it danced and fluttered and moved about. He suddenly found himself treading circumspectly and with caution. The stillness in the wood was so peculiar. There was a rustle among the ferns and leaves, and something shot across the path 10 yards ahead, stopped abruptly an instant with its head cocked sideways to stare, then dived again beneath the underbrush with the speed of a shadow. He started like a frightened child, laughing the next second that a mere pheasant could have made him jump. In the distance he heard wheels upon the road and wondered why the sound was pleasant. "Good old butcher's cart," he said to himself, then realized that he was going in the wrong direction and had somehow got turned round, for the road should be behind him, not in front. And he hurriedly took another narrow glade that lost itself in greenness to the right. "That's my direction, of course," he said. "The trees have mixed me up a bit, it seems." Then found himself abruptly by the gate he had first climbed over. He had merely made a circle. Surprise became almost discomfiture then, and a man, dressed like a gamekeeper in browny green, leaned against the gate, hitting his leg with a switch. "I'm making for Mr. Lumley's farm," explained the walker. "This is his wood, I think," then stopped dead, because it was no man at all, but merely an effect of light and shade and foliage. He stepped back to reconstruct the singular illusion, but the wind shook the branches roughly here on the edge of the wood, and the foliage refused to reconstruct the figure. The leaves all rustled strangely, and just then the sun went behind a cloud. The whole wood looked otherwise. Yet how the mind could be thus doubly deceived was indeed remarkable, for it almost seemed to him the man had answered, spoken, or was this the shuffling noise the branches made, and had pointed with his switch to the notice board upon the nearest tree. The words rang on in his head, but of course he had imagined them. "No, it's not his wood, it's ours." And some village wit, moreover, had changed the lettering on the weather-beaten board, for it read quite plainly, "Trespassers will be persecuted." And while the astonished clerk read the words and chuckled, he said to himself, thinking what a tale he'd have to tell his wife and children later, "The blooming wood has tried to chuck me out, but I'll go in again. Why, it's only a matter of a square acre at most. I'm bound to reach the fields on the other side if I keep straight on." He remembered his position in the office. He had a certain dignity to maintain. The cloud passed from below the sun, and light splashed suddenly in all manner of unlikely places. The man went straight on. He felt a touch of puzzling confusion somewhere. This way the copse had of shifting from sunshine into shadow doubtless troubled sight a little. To his relief, at last, a new glade opened through the trees and disclosed the fields, with a glimpse of the red house in the distance at the far end. But a little wicket gate that stood across the path had first to be climbed, and as he scrambled heavily over, for it would not open, he got the astonishing feeling that it slid off sideways beneath his weight and towards the wood. Like the mink staircases at Harrods and Earl's Court, it began to glide off with him. It was quite horrible. He made a violent effort to get down before it carried him into the trees, but his feet became entangled with the bar and umbrella, so that he fell heavily upon the farther side, arms spread across the grass and nettles, boots clutched between the first and second bars. He lay there a moment like a man crucified upside down, and while he struggled to get disentangled, feet, bars and umbrella formed a regular net. He saw the little man in browny green go past him with extreme rapidity through the wood. The man was laughing. He passed across the glade some 50 yards away, and he was not alone this time. A companion, like himself, went with him. The clerk, now upon his feet again, watched them disappear into the gloom of green beyond. "They're tramps, not gamekeepers," he said to himself, half mortified and half angry. But his heart was thumping dreadfully, and he dared not utter all his thought. He examined the wicket gate, convinced it was a trick gate somehow, then went hurriedly on again, disturbed beyond belief to see that the glade no longer opened into fields, but curved away to the right. What in the world had happened to him? His sight was so utterly at fault. Again the sun flamed out abruptly and lit the floor of the wood with pools of silver, and at the same moment a violent gust of wind passed shouting overhead. Drops fell clattering everywhere upon the leaves, making a sharp pattering as of many footsteps. The whole copse shuddered and went moving. Rain, by George, thought the clerk, and feeling for his umbrella, discovered he had lost it. He turned back to the gate and found it lying on the farther side. To his amazement, he saw the fields at the far end of the glade, the red house, too, ashine in the sunset. He laughed then, for of course, in his struggle with the gate, he had somehow got turned around, had fallen back instead of forwards. Climbing over, this time quite easily, he retraced his steps. The silver band he saw had been torn from the umbrella. No doubt his foot, a nail or something had caught in it and ripped it off. The clerk began to run. He felt extraordinarily dismayed. But while he ran, the entire wood ran with him, round him, to and fro, trees shifting like living things, leaves folding and unfolding, trunks darting backwards and forwards, and branches disclosing enormous empty spaces, then closing up again before he could look into them. There were footsteps everywhere, and laughing, crying voices and crowds of figures gathering just behind his back, till the glade, he knew, was thick with moving life. The wind in his ears, of course, produced the voices and the laughter, while sun and clouds, plunging the copse alternately in shadow and bright dazzling light, created the figures. But he didn't like it, and went as fast as ever his sturdy legs could take him. He was frightened now. This was no story for his wife and children. He ran like the wind, but his feet made no sound upon the soft mossy turf. Then, to his horror, he saw that the glade grew narrow. Nettles and weeds stood thick across it. It dwindled down into a tiny path, and 20 yards ahead it stopped finally and melted off among the trees. What the trick gate had failed to achieve, this twisting glade accomplished easily, carried him in bodily among the dense and crowding trees. There was only one thing to do. Turn sharply and dash back again, run headlong into the life that followed at his back, followed so closely too that now it almost touched him, pushing him in. And with reckless courage, this was what he did. It seemed a fearful thing to do. He turned with a sort of violent spring, head down and shoulders forward, hands stretched before his face. He made the plunge like a hunted creature. He charged full tilt the other way, meeting the wind now in his face. Good Lord! The glade behind him had closed up as well. There was no longer any path at all. Turning round and round, like an animal at bay, he searched for an opening, a way of escape. Searched frantically, breathlessly, terrified now in his bones. But foliage surrounded him. Branches blocked the way. The trees stood close and still, unshaken by a breath of wind, and the sun dipped that moment behind a great black cloud. The entire wood turned dark and silent. It watched him. Perhaps it was this final touch of sudden blackness that made him act so foolishly, as though he had really lost his head. At any rate, without pausing to think, he dashed headlong in among the trees again. There was a sensation of being stiflingly surrounded and entangled, and that he must break out at all costs, out and away into the open of the blessed fields and air. He did this ill-considered thing and apparently charged straight into an oak that deliberately moved into his path to stop him. He saw it shift across a good full yard, and being a measuring man accustomed to theodolite and chain, he ought to know. He fell, saw stars, and felt 1,000 tiny fingers tugging and pulling at his hands and neck and ankles. The stinging nettles, no doubt, were responsible for this. He thought of it later. At the moment it felt diabolically calculated. But another remarkable illusion was not so easily explained. For all in a moment, it seemed, the entire wood went sliding past him, with a thick, deep rustling of leaves and laughter, myriad footsteps, and tiny little active, energetic shapes. 2 men in browny green gave him a mighty hoist, and he opened his eyes to find himself lying in the meadow, beside the stile where first his incredible adventure had begun. The wood stood in its usual place and stared down upon him in the sunlight. There was the red house in the distance as before. Above him grinned the weather-beaten notice board. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Dishevelled in mind and body, and a good deal shaken in his official soul, the clerk walked slowly across the fields. But on the way he glanced once more at the postcard of instructions, and saw with dull amazement that the inked-out sentence was quite legible, after all, beneath the scratches made across it. "There is a short cut through the wood I want cut down, if you care to take it." Only "care" was so badly written it looked more like another word. The C was uncommonly like a D. "That's the copse that spoils my view of the downs, you see," his client explained to him later, pointing across the fields and referring to the ordnance map beside him. "I want it cut down and a path made so-and-so." His finger indicated direction on the map. "The Fairy Wood, it's still called, and it's far older than this house. Come now, if you're ready, Mr. Thomas, we might go out and have a look at it." If you're really enjoying our wonderfully ghostly tales, I've recorded lots more. You'll find the links in the description of this video if you'd like to buy audiobooks or indeed just listen. But now we're going to listen to some horrific, gruesome tales from the Cotswolds past. Hi there, and welcome to the Cotswold Explorer. I'm Robin Chapra, and tonight we're starting an autumnal tour of the Cotswolds, chasing up a selection of grisly and gruesome stories which have found their way to us sometimes from our lovely viewers, but mostly from Ross's great work, searching out the dark world of hauntings, murders, and villainy of all kinds. We are, of course, used to seeing the picture postcard villages and beautiful stone cottages of this wonderful region, but tonight, and over the next few weeks, we will look at a different side to the Cotswolds. From the city of Bath, all the way up through familiar spots like Tetbury, Cirencester, Stow-on-the-Wold and Chipping Campden, we will uncover tales of unsolved murders, dreadful poisonings, and inexplicable disappearances. We start tonight in the amazing city of Bath, at the very southern end of the Cotswolds limestone ridge. This stunning city, certainly amongst the most beautiful in the entire country, is the epitome of genteel, elegant city life, and has been since the time of the Romans. Not even Bath, however, is immune from the darker side of life. Our first story stems from the late 19th century. It involves the murder of a young servant girl. In August 1891, Elsie Adeline Luke disappeared from her lodgings in Bath. She was known to be an outgoing sort of girl, enthusiastically chasing her various love interests, much to the irritation, disapproval, and perhaps even a smattering of jealousy of the other local girls. And so, When it was noticed that she hadn't been seen for a few days, it was assumed that she'd simply run off with another romantic attachment. It was only after a few weeks that two men, one by the name of John Dill, found some blood-stained cuffs and a gold watch and chain on the top of Hampton Down. Dill told his companion he would deliver the items to the local police station, but decided instead to keep them for himself. It was therefore years before any connection to Elsie was made. Over 2 years later, in September 1893, the skeleton of a young woman was discovered in a cave in the area of Hampton Down. On examining the skeleton, the local doctor found that the skull had taken a serious beating, and it became clear that the poor woman had been particularly brutally murdered. To many locals, the conclusion was obvious. This must be the missing Elsie Adeline Luke. Not only was it the skeleton of a young woman in her 20s, but it had also been found wrapped in some linen bearing the mark of a certain Mrs. Kerry. Mrs. Kerry had employed Elsie as a cook from March to July in 1891, but had sacked her as she turned out to be an irredeemable thief. She had stolen the linen, along with many other things. Ironically, however, it was thanks to her thieving habits that her skeleton was eventually identified. Just before her disappearance, it was well known that an apprentice coach builder by the name of Arthur Stevenson Coombs had been one of Elsie's latest beaux. The briefest of investigations revealed that Arthur himself was in the habit of courting more than one lady at a time, and so he became the prime suspect in the murder of Elsie Adeline Luke. He, however, insisted to the superintendent leading the case that he was entirely innocent. "I only kept her company. After that, I'm no use to you," he said. Despite his emphatic denial, he was charged with her murder. The suspicions of the police officers continued despite his denials. Many people had seen the lad with Elsie and said he had often spoken of her in violent terms. "She ought to be dead or killed," he had once been heard to say. Added to this, shortly after Elsie's disappearance, he had turned up at the Royal United Hospital with an injured thumb. In the official documentation, his injury was recorded as a human bite. Considering the timing, this did not help the case. Further muddying the water, however, one of Coombs's other girlfriends at the time, Polly Shepherd, had also made threatening remarks about Elsie, perhaps naturally jealous of her rival. When the examining magistrate started his interrogation of Arthur Coombs on the 29th of September 1893, the young man was clearly very agitated. As witnesses took the stand, a jury expecting answers ended up with more questions. One of Elsie's fellow servants remembered her smuggling a young man into the house shortly before her disappearance, and she was certain it was not Coombs. A search of Coombs' home revealed a large bag of letters from his various lady friends. And strangely, there were none to be found from Elsie, despite witnesses confidently stating that the two had written letters to one another. Many of the letters were actually from Coombs' present girlfriend, the aforementioned Polly Shepherd. They showed she was most distressed about Arthur's romantic pursuits, especially his affair with young Elsie. More than once she rebuked Coombs for keeping company with her, and made vague threats that something unpleasant might happen to her. In fact, on one occasion, the two young women had scrapped, during which Elsie knocked Polly to the ground. The examination went on with no definitive results. Arthur dismissed the importance of his hospital visit, claiming he'd injured his thumb during an altercation at the recent Liberal fete. However, a police officer who had been in attendance at the fete testified that that event had been entirely peaceful. Eventually, under considerable pressure from his erstwhile companion, John Dill came forward with the gold watch and cuffs that they had discovered on the down. But rather than helping the case against Arthur, it was hard to explain why, had he been guilty, he wouldn't have kept the watch and chain, almost certainly another of Elsie's ill-gotten gains, for himself. By this point, 2 years had passed since the murder, and all the evidence was circumstantial in nature. The coroner stated that suspicion might hang over a man, but it should not hang him. The jury took note. There was too little evidence to convict Arthur, and the murder of poor Elsie Adeline Luke remains unsolved to this day. Continuing north, not far away, is the town known as the capital of the Cotswolds, Cirencester. Life was challenging in the mid-18th century. In a time where a small-scale offence like petty theft could land you with the same consequences as murder, there was little to stop desperate criminals killing out of sheer panic. They quite literally thought they might as well be hanged for a sheep as a lamb. Around Cirencester in 1743, a group of 3 men committed many such crimes. Thomas Cambry, John Curtis, and Thomas Steptoe worked as labourers during the day, but by night they searched for other people's valuables to steal. Just outside the town, at Bowling Green Lane, James Millington and his wife Anne lived a peaceful life. They'd been married for over 50 years and had endured much. In an age of high mortality rates, they had lost at least 3 children at tragically young ages. Fortunately, their 6 surviving children went on to live healthy lives, and the couple now were enjoying their twilight years in peace. Sadly, this tranquility was to be short-lived. On the 25th of October, 1743, wrapped up around the open fire in the company of their grown-up daughter Esther, they were shocked, not to say horrified, when the criminal trio of Cambry, Curtis and Steptoe burst through the door, demanding money and valuables. James, scared out of his wits, gave them what he had on him, but this was not enough to satisfy the robbers. They proceeded to beat him extremely severely in front of his wife and daughter. As the villains grew increasingly frustrated, they turned on Anne, pushing her up against the wall and repeating their demands. When the poor woman was unable to provide what they were looking for, Cambry stabbed her through the left breast with his knife, and the 3 men then ransacked the whole house. Eventually, they fled with £23, several bottles of alcohol, a gun, and a greatcoat belonging to James. Poor Anne died just 3 days later from her injury, and the trio were quickly arrested. Despite their best efforts to fabricate alibis, a handful of witnesses came forward to place the trio in Cirencester during the time of the robbery. Unfortunately for Cambry and Curtis, Thomas Steptoe, a villain of the most despicable type, gave his accomplices away in a deal which provided him with a lighter sentence than his 2 companions. Curtis and Cambry were hanged in Cirencester in March 1744, Cambry denying his guilt to the very end. One onlooker, who had met the 2 criminals whilst out drinking on many occasions, asked how he could die with a lie in his mouth. Cambry was unable to think of a rebuttal, as the stool was kicked from under his feet, and he went to his dark fate. His chained body was hung up in a prominent place near the home of the Millingtons, as a warning to other criminals. Our next tale takes place not far from Cirencester, in the town of Fairford and the nearby village of Quennington. In the mid-1800s, a young girl called Anne Ind worked in service in Leckhampton, and later as a labourer in Quennington. She'd recently married her husband William, and because the two didn't have much money, they lived with Anne's father, who also worked as a labourer. There was never any sign that she had a poor relationship with her father. Strange, then, that on January the 5th, 1858, she travelled into Fairford and bought some arsenic. She had to sign for the poison, giving the reason for her purchase that she had some rats to kill. She was served in the shop by someone she knew from her childhood, and he clearly thought it important to point out that she could easily buy something much safer to kill vermin. But she ignored his advice, and her childhood friend sold her the arsenic. Just 2 days later, on January the 7th, her father Joseph came home from work, and Anne had prepared a pot of tea for him. He normally drank 4 or 5 cups after a long day's work, and wasted no time in tucking in as usual. In the evening, he began to feel stomach pains. He went to bed in a bad state and got barely any sleep. In the morning, in an attempt to fortify himself for the day's work, he drank another cup of tea from the same teapot, and minutes later was sick again. Later in the day, he was sent home from work to recover, and that's when he told Anne that he had a suspicion what had happened. She, of course, feigned ignorance, but despite her protestations, eventually the police were called, and Joseph related the tale, explaining his suspicions. "I would not have any more tea out of the pot because I thought there was a trap set in it," he told the police. Although unwell for a while, he survived the attempted murder. Anne, however, was arrested and prosecuted, and found guilty of attempted murder, and imprisoned in London for the rest of her life. Her father Joseph remained alone in Quennington until well into his 80s. He had not died by Anne's hand, but it's safe to say her actions may have dissuaded him from drinking as much tea as hitherto. Just before we head north to Stow-on-the-Wold, we'll stop off in the village of Chedworth, hidden just off the Foss Way, for a peculiar story concerning the murder of a postman. At 7 o'clock in the morning on the 24th of December 1924, postman William Gardner stepped into the morning air, ready to begin his shift. Just as he was closing the door behind him, the sound of a gunshot rang around the village, and Gardner fell to the ground. Alarmed neighbours, along with William's wife, rushed out to help the wounded man, who was then taken to Cirencester Memorial Hospital. Living as they were in a close village community, it wasn't long before the assailant was identified as a postman colleague of William's, Frederick Broad, who had resigned his job the day before. Superintendent Wyman from Northleach Station soon arrived, and a manhunt for Broad began. He was tracked past a farm and down a lane towards Chedworth Woods before the trail went cold. But just hours later, a railway worker happened upon a body lying next to the railway line, not far from the Roman villa and a stone's throw from the tunnel. The corpse was highly dismembered, and a double-barreled shotgun lay nearby. The body was taken to Chedworth railway station and thence to Stroud, where the following day an inquest was opened by the Stroud coroner, Mr. Morton Bell. A jury was sworn in, and Frederick's brother William identified the body. He also gave the police some information that would prove enlightening. Although Frederick was physically healthy, he was somewhat strange at times, and had been seeing a doctor for his fits. The inquest was adjourned until the 1st of January, and in the brief recess over Christmas, the press did some investigating of their own. They interviewed a handful of local residents and found that Frederick Broad had recently become extremely discontented at work. His postal round had been changed, and he'd been given a shorter route, which meant he earned slightly less money. William Gardner had taken over his former round, and Broad had convinced himself that Gardner was responsible for the change. The Cheltenham postmaster released a statement in which he confirmed that there was nothing personal in the changing of rounds. No report whatever had reached me of any unsatisfactory working on the part of Broad which would lead to his being changed from one duty to another. Whatever action has been taken is not the outcome of any complaint about duty. The fact of the matter is, we have reorganised the whole of the postal service in the district in connection with the modernisation and increased efficiency of the service. William Gardner recovered in hospital over the festive period, despite having an extremely badly damaged face and jaw. And on the 1st of January, the inquest resumed, and the first witness was Frederick Broad's father. He said that at 6:30 on 24th of December, his son, dressed in his postal uniform, left home, claiming he was going out to assist his replacement, delivering the mail. Despite his father advising him to stay at home, Frederick left, and after breakfast, when a gunshot rang out across the village, they realised that Fred's shotgun was not on the gun rack. The next witness was train driver Peter James Morse, a resident of Cheltenham and employed by Great Western Railway. On the 24th of December, he was the driver of the train leaving Andover Junction at 8 a.m. He passed through Chedworth station and sounded the whistle as he entered the tunnel, as was customary at the time. Upon exiting the tunnel, he thought the engine had struck a stone, but later agreed he had likely knocked someone down. This was confirmed by James Buttle, the railway worker who had discovered Broad's body by the tracks. He'd first come across a hand and an arm, and then the body to which they belonged, about 800 yards away. There was no public crossing in the area. It looked very much like a tragic accident. The coroner summed up that Broad had been killed by the passing train, but the question remained as to whether he had stepped in front of it on purpose or not. The jury concluded that Broad was not of sound mind and expressed their sympathy with his family. Our next story is The Room in the Tower by E.F. Benson. It's probable that everybody who is at all a constant dreamer has had at least one experience of an event or a sequence of circumstances which have come to his mind in sleep, being subsequently realized in the material world. But, in my opinion, so far from this being a strange thing, it would be far odder if this fulfillment did not occasionally happen, since our dreams are, as a rule, concerned with people whom we know and places with which we are familiar, such as might very naturally occur in the awake and daylit world. True, these dreams are often broken into by some absurd and fantastic incident, which puts them out of court in regard to their subsequent fulfillment, but on the mere calculation of chances, it doesn't appear in the least unlikely that a dream imagined by anyone who dreams constantly should occasionally come true. Not long ago, for instance, I experienced such a fulfillment of a dream, which seems to me in no way remarkable and to have no kind of psychical significance. The manner of it was as follows. A certain friend of mine, living abroad, is amiable enough to write to me about once in a fortnight. Thus, when 14 days or thereabouts have elapsed since I last heard from him, my mind, probably either consciously or subconsciously, is expectant of a letter from him. One night last week, I dreamed that as I was going upstairs to dress for dinner, I heard, as I often heard, the sound of the postman's knock on my front door, and diverted my direction downstairs instead. There, among other correspondence, was a letter from him. Thereafter, the fantastic entered, for on opening it I found inside the ace of diamonds, and scribbled across it in his well-known handwriting, "I am sending you this for safe custody. As you know, it is running an unreasonable risk to keep aces in Italy." The next evening I was just preparing to go upstairs to dress when I heard the postman's knock, and did precisely as I had done in my dream. There, among other letters, was one from my friend. Only it did not contain the ace of diamonds. Had it done so, I should have attached more weight to the matter, which, as it stands, seems to me a perfectly ordinary coincidence. No doubt I consciously or subconsciously expected a letter from him, and this suggested to me my dream. Similarly, the fact that he for a fortnight suggested to him that he should do so. But occasionally it is not so easy to find such an explanation, and for the following story I can find no explanation at all. It came out of the dark, and into the dark it has gone again. All my life I've been an habitual dreamer. The nights are few, that is to say, when I do not find on awakening in the morning that some mental experience has been mine, and sometimes all night long, apparently, a series of the most dazzling adventures befell me. Almost without exception these adventures are pleasant, though often merely trivial. It is of an exception that I am going to speak. It was when I was about 16 that a certain dream first came to me, and this is how it befell. It opened with my being set down at the door of a big red brick house, where, I understood, I was going to stay. The servant who opened the door told me that tea was being served in the garden, and led me through a low, dark-panelled hall with a large open fireplace, onto a cheerful green lawn set around with flower beds. There were, grouped about the tea table, a small party of people, but they were all strangers to me except one, who was a schoolfellow called Jack Stone, clearly the son of the house, and he introduced me to his mother and father and a couple of sisters. I was, I remember, somewhat astonished to find myself here, for the boy in question was scarcely known to me, and I rather disliked what I knew of him. Moreover, he had left school nearly a year before. The afternoon was very hot, and an intolerable oppression reigned. On the far side of the lawn ran a red brick wall, with an iron gate in its centre, outside which stood a walnut tree. We sat in the shadow of the house, opposite a row of long windows, inside which I could see a table with cloth laid glimmering with glass and silver. This garden front of the house was very long, and at one end of it stood a tower of 3 stories, which looked to me much older than the rest of the building. Before long, Mrs. Stone, who, like the rest of the party, had sat in absolute silence, said to me, "Jack will show you your room. I've given you the room in the tower." Quite inexplicably, my heart sank at her words. I felt as if I had known that I should have the room in the tower, and that it contained something dreadful and significant. Jack instantly got up, and I understood that I had to follow him. In silence, I passed through the hall and a great oak staircase with many corners, and arrived at a small landing with 2 doors set in it. He pushed one of these open for me to enter, and without coming in himself, closed it after me. Then I knew that my conjecture had been right. There was something awful in the room, and with the terror of nightmare growing swiftly and enveloping me, I awoke in a spasm of terror. Now that dream, or variations on it, occurred to me intermittently for 15 years. Most often it came in exactly this form: the arrival, the tea laid out on the lawn, the deadly silence succeeded by that one deadly sentence, the mounting with Jack Stone up to the room in the tower where horror dwelt, and it always came to a close in the nightmare of terror at that which was in the room, though I never saw what it was. At other times I experienced variations on this same theme. Occasionally, for instance, we would be sitting at dinner in the dining room, into the windows of which I had looked on the first night when the dream of this house visited me. But wherever we were, there was the same silence, the same sense of dreadful oppression and foreboding. And the silence I knew would always be broken by Mrs. Stone saying to me, "Jack will show you your room. I've given you the room in the tower." upon which, this was invariable, I had to follow him up the oak staircase with many corners, and enter the place that I dreaded more and more each time that I visited it in sleep. Or again I would find myself playing cards, still in silence, in a drawing-room lit with immense chandeliers that gave a blinding illumination. What the game was I have no idea. What I remember with a sense of miserable anticipation was that soon Mrs. Stone would get up and say to me, "Jack will show you your room. I've given you the room in the tower." This drawing-room, where we played cards, was next to the dining-room, and as I've said, was always brilliantly illuminated, whereas the rest of the house was full of dusk and shadows. And yet, how often, in spite of those bouquets of light, have I not pored over the cards that were dealt me, scarcely able, for some reason, to see them. Their designs, too, were strange. There were no red suits, but all were black, and among them there were certain cards which were black all over. I hated and dreaded those. As this dream continued to recur, I got to know the greater part of the house. There was a smoking room beyond the drawing-room, at the end of a passage with a green baize door. It was always very dark there, and as often as I went there I passed somebody whom I could not see in the doorway coming out. Curious developments, too, took place in the characters that peopled the dream, as might happen to living persons. Mrs. Stone, for instance, who when I first saw her had been black-haired, became grey, and instead of rising briskly as she had done at first when she said, "Jack will show you your room. I've given you the room in the tower," got up very feebly, as if the strength was leaving her limbs. Jack also grew up and became a rather ill-looking young man with a brown moustache, while one of the sisters ceased to appear, and I understood she was married. Then it so happened that I was not visited by this dream for 6 months or more, and I began to hope, in such inexplicable dread did I hold it, that it had passed away for good. But one night after this interval, I again found myself being shown out onto the lawn for tea, and Mrs. Stone was not there, while the others were all dressed in black. At once I guessed the reason, and my heart leapt at the thought that perhaps this time I should not have to sleep in the room in the tower, and though we usually all sat in silence, on this occasion the sense of relief made me talk and laugh as I had never yet done. But even then matters were not altogether comfortable, for no one else spoke, but they all looked secretly at one another. And soon the foolish stream of my talk ran dry, and gradually an apprehension worse than anything I had previously known gained on me as the light slowly faded. Suddenly a voice which I knew well broke the stillness. The voice of Mrs. Stone, saying, "Jack will show you your room. I've given you the room in the tower." It seemed to come from near the gate in the red brick wall that bounded the lawn, and looking up I saw that the grass outside was sown thick with gravestones. A curious greyish light shone from them, and I could read the lettering on the grave nearest me, and it was, "In evil memory of Julia Stone." And as usual Jack got up, and again I followed him through the hall and up the staircase with many corners. On this occasion it was darker than usual, and when I passed into the room in the tower I could only just see the furniture, the position of which was already familiar to me. Also there was a dreadful odour of decay in the room, and I woke, screaming. The dream, with such variations and developments as I have mentioned, went on at intervals for 15 years. Sometimes I would dream it 2 or 3 nights in succession. Once, as I've said, there was an intermission of 6 months, but taking a reasonable average, I would say that I dreamt it quite as often as once in a month. It had, as is plain, something of nightmare about it, since it always ended in the same appalling terror, which, so far from getting less, seemed to me to gather fresh fear every time that I experienced it. There was, too, a strange and dreadful consistency about it. The characters in it, as I've mentioned, got regularly older. Death and marriage visited this silent family, and I never in dream, after Mrs. Stone had died, set eyes on her again. But it was always her voice that told me that the room in the tower was prepared for me, and whether we had tea out on the lawn or the scene was laid in one of the rooms overlooking it, I could always see her gravestone standing just outside the iron gate. It was the same, too, with the married daughter. Usually she was not present, but once or twice she returned again in company with a man whom I took to be her husband. He, too, like the rest of them, was always silent. But owing to the constant repetition of the dream, I had ceased to attach in my waking hours any significance to it. I never met Jack Stone again during all those years, nor did I ever see a house that resembled this dark house of my dream. And then something happened. I had been in London in this year up till the end of the July, and during the first week in August went down to stay with a friend in a house he'd taken for the summer months in the Ashdown Forest district of Sussex. I left London early, for John Clinton was to meet me at Forest Row Station, and we were going to spend the day golfing and go to his house in the evening. He had his motor with him, and we set off about 5 of the afternoon after a thoroughly delightful day for the drive, the distance being some 10 miles. As it was still so early, we didn't have tea at the clubhouse, but waited till we should get home. As we drove, the weather, which up till then had been, though hot, deliciously fresh, seemed to me to alter in quality and become very stagnant and oppressive, and I felt that indefinable sense of ominous apprehension that I am accustomed to before thunder. John, however, did not share my views, attributing my loss of lightness to the fact that I had lost both my matches. Events proved, however, that I was right, though I do not think that the thunderstorm that broke that night was the sole cause of my depression. Our way lay through deep, high-banked lanes, and before we had gone very far, I fell asleep, and was only awakened by the stopping of the motor. And with a sudden thrill, partly of fear but chiefly of curiosity, I found myself standing in the doorway of my house of dream. We went, I half wondering whether or not I was dreaming still, through a low oak-panelled hall and out onto the lawn, where tea was laid in the shadow of the house. It was set in flower beds, a red brick wall with a gate in it bounded one side, and out beyond that was a space of rough grass with a walnut tree. The facade of the house was very long, and at one end stood a 3-storied tower, markedly older than the rest. Here, for the moment, all resemblance to the repeated dream ceased. There was no silent and somehow terrible family, but a large assembly of exceedingly cheerful people, all of whom were known to me. And in spite of the horror with which the dream itself had always filled me, I felt nothing of it now that the scene of it was thus reproduced before me. But I felt intensest curiosity as to what was going to happen. Tea pursued its cheerful course, and before long Mrs. Clinton got up. And at that moment I think I knew what she was going to say. She spoke to me, and what she said was, "Jack will show you your room. I've given you the room in the tower." At that, for half a second, the horror of the dream took hold of me again. But it quickly passed, and again I felt nothing more than the most intense curiosity. It was not very long before it was amply satisfied. John turned to me. "Right up at the top of the house," he said, "but I think you'll be comfortable. We're absolutely full up. Would you like to go and see it now?" By Jove, I believe that you're right and that we are going to have a thunderstorm. How dark it's become." I got up and followed him. We passed through the hall and up the perfectly familiar staircase. Then he opened the door and I went in. And at that moment, sheer, unreasoning terror again possessed me. I didn't know what I feared. I simply feared. Then, like a sudden recollection when one remembers a name which has long escaped the memory, I knew what I feared. I feared Mrs. Stone, whose grave with a sinister inscription in evil memory I had so often seen in my dream just beyond the lawn which lay below my window. And then once more the fear passed, so completely that I wondered what there was to fear. And I found myself sober, quiet and sane, in the room in the tower, the name of which I had so often heard in my dream, and the scene of which was so familiar. I looked around it with a certain sense of proprietorship, and found that nothing had been changed from the dreaming nights in which I knew it so well. Just to the left of the door was the bed, lengthways along the wall, with the head of it in the angle. In a line with it was the fireplace and a small bookcase. Opposite the door, the outer wall was pierced by two lattice-paned windows, between which stood the dressing-table, while ranged along the fourth wall was the washing-stand and a big cupboard. My luggage had already been unpacked, for the furniture of dressing and undressing lay orderly on the washstand and toilet table, while my dinner clothes were spread out on the coverlet of the bed. And then, with a sudden start of unexplained dismay, I saw that there were two rather conspicuous objects which I had not seen before in my dreams. One, a life-sized oil painting of Mrs. Stone. The other, a black and white sketch of Jack Stone, representing him as he had appeared to me only a week before in the last of the series of these repeated dreams, a rather secret and evil-looking man of about 30. His picture hung between the windows, looking straight across the room at the other portrait, which hung at the side of the bed. At that I looked next, and as I looked I felt once more the horror of nightmare seize me. It represented Mrs. as I had seen her last in my dreams, old and withered and white-haired, but in spite of the evident feebleness of body, a dreadful exuberance and vitality shone through the envelope of flesh, an exuberance wholly malign, a vitality that foamed and frothed with unimaginable evil. Evil beamed from the narrow, leering eyes. It laughed in the demon-like mouth. The whole face was instilled with some secret and appalling mirth. The hands clasped together on the knee seemed shaking with suppressed and nameless glee. Then I saw also that it was signed in the left-hand bottom corner, and wondering who the artist could be, I looked more closely and read the inscription, "Julia Stone, by Julia Stone." There came a tap at the door, and John Clinton entered. "Got everything you want?" he asked. "Rather more than I want," said I, pointing to the picture. He laughed. "Hard-featured old lady," he said. "By herself, too, I remember. Anyhow, she can't have flattered herself much." "But don't you see," said I, "it's scarcely a human face at all. It's the face of some witch, of some devil." He looked at it more closely. "Yes, it isn't very pleasant," he said. "Scarcely a bedside manner, eh? Yes, I can imagine getting the nightmare if I went to sleep with that close to my bed. I'll have it taken down if you like." "I really wish you would," I said. He rang the bell, and with the help of a servant we detached the picture and carried it out onto the landing and put it with its face to the wall. "By Jove, the old lady's a weight," said John, mopping his forehead. "I wonder if she had something on her mind." The extraordinary weight of the picture had struck me too. I was about to reply when I caught sight of my own hand. There was blood on it in considerable quantities, covering the whole palm. "I've cut myself somehow," said I. John gave a little startled exclamation. "Why, I have too," he said. Simultaneously the footman took out his handkerchief and wiped his hand with it. I saw that there was blood also on his handkerchief. John and I went back into the tower room and washed the blood off, but neither on his hand nor on mine was there the slightest trace of a scratch or cut. It seemed to me that, having ascertained this, we both, by a sort of tacit consent, did not allude to it again. Something in my case had dimly occurred to me that I did not wish to think about. It was but a conjecture, but I fancied that I knew the same thing had occurred to him. The heat and oppression of the air, for the storm we had expected was still undischarged, increased very much after dinner, and for some time most of the party, among whom we were John Clinton and myself. The heat and oppression of the air, for the storm we had expected was still undischarged, increased very much after dinner, and for some time most of the party, among whom were John Clinton and myself, sat outside on the path bounding the lawn where we had had tea. The night was absolutely dark, and no twinkle of star or moon ray could penetrate the pall of cloud that overset the sky. By degrees our assembly thinned. The women went up to bed, men dispersed to the smoking or billiard room, and by 11 o'clock my host and I were the only two left. All the evening I thought that he had something on his mind, and as soon as we were alone, he spoke. By dint of telling myself that I was not going to think about it, I had succeeded in not doing so, and I didn't want, especially just at bedtime, to be reminded of it. "I don't know," said I, "and I don't really care so long as the picture of Mrs. Stone is not by my bed." He got up. "But it's odd," he said. "Ah, now you'll see another odd thing." A dog of his, an Irish terrier by breed, had come out of the house as we talked. The door behind us into the hall was open, and a bright oblong of light shone across the lawn to the iron gate which led onto the rough grass outside, where the walnut tree stood. I saw that the dog had all his hackles up, bristling with rage and fright. His lips were curled back from his teeth as if he was ready to spring at something, and he was growling to himself. He took not the slightest notice of his master or me, but stiffly and tensely walked across the grass to the iron gate. There he stood for a moment, looking through the bars and still growling. Then, of a sudden, his courage seemed to desert him, and he gave one long howl and scuttled back to the house with a curious, crouching sort of movement. "He does that half a dozen times a day," said John. "He sees something which he both hates and fears." I walked to the gate and looked over it. Something was moving on the grass outside, and soon a sound which I could not instantly identify came to my ears. Then I remembered what it was. It was the purring of a cat. I lit a match and saw the purrer, a big blue Persian, walking round and round in little circles just outside the gate, stepping high and ecstatically, with tail carried aloft like a banner. Its eyes were bright and shining, and every now and then it put its head down and sniffed at the grass. I laughed. "The end of that mystery, I'm afraid," I said. "Here's a large cat having Walpurgis night all alone." "Yes, that's Darius," said John. "He spends half the day and all night there. But that's not the end of the dog mystery. For Toby and he are the best of friends, but the beginning of the cat mystery. What's the cat doing there, and why is Darius pleased while Toby is terror-stricken?" At that moment I remembered the rather horrible detail of my dreams, when I saw through the gate, just where the cat was now, the white tombstone with the sinister inscription. But before I could answer, the rain began, as suddenly and heavily as if a tap had been turned on, and simultaneously the big cat squeezed through the bars of the gate and came leaping across the lawn to the house for shelter. Then it sat in the doorway, looking out eagerly into the dark. It spat and struck at John with its paw as he pushed it in order to close the door. Somehow, with the portrait of Julia Stone in the passage outside, the room in the tower had absolutely no alarm for me. And as I went to bed, feeling very sleepy and heavy, I had nothing more than interest for the curious incident about our bleeding hands and the conduct of the cat and dog. The last thing I looked at before I put out my light was the square, empty space by my bed where the portrait had been. Here the paper was of its original full tint of dark red. Over the rest of the walls it had faded. Then I blew out my candle and instantly fell asleep. My awakening was equally instantaneous, and I sat bolt upright in bed under the impression that some bright light had been flashed in my face, though it was now absolutely pitch dark. I knew exactly where I was, in the room which I had dreaded in dreams, but no horror that I ever felt when asleep approached the fear that now invaded and froze my brain. Immediately after, a peal of thunder crackled just above the house, but the probability that it was only a flash of lightning which awoke me gave no reassurance to my galloping heart. Something, I knew, was in the room with me, and instinctively I put out my right hand, which was nearest the wall, to keep it away, and my hand touched the edge of a picture frame hanging close to me. I sprang out of bed, upsetting the small table that stood by it, and I heard my watch, candle, and matches clatter onto the floor. But for the moment there was no need of light, for a blinding flash leaped out of the clouds and showed me that by my bed again hung the picture of Mrs. Stone. And instantly the room went into blackness again. But in that flash I saw another thing also. A figure that leaned over the end of my bed, watching me. It was dressed in some close-clinging white garment, spotted and stained with mould, and the face was that of the portrait. Overhead the thunder cracked and roared, and when it ceased and the deathly stillness succeeded, I heard the rustle of movement coming nearer me, and, more horrible yet, perceived an odour of corruption and decay. And then a hand was laid on the side of my neck, and close beside my ear I heard quick-taken, eager breathing. Yet I knew that this thing, though it could be perceived by touch, by smell, by eye, and by ear, was still not of this earth, but something that had passed out of the body and had power to make itself manifest. Then a voice, already familiar to me, spoke. "I knew you would come to the room in the tower," it said. "I've been long waiting for you. At last you've come. Tonight I shall feast. Before long we will feast together." The quick breathing came closer to me. I could feel it on my neck. At that, the terror, which I think had paralyzed me for the moment, gave way to the wild instinct of self-preservation. I hit wildly with both arms, kicking out at the same moment, and heard a little animal squeal, and something soft dropped with a thud beside me. I took a couple of steps forward, nearly tripping up over whatever it was that lay there, and by the merest good luck found the handle of the door. In another second I ran out on the landing and had banged the door behind. Almost at the same moment I heard a door open somewhere below, and John Clinton, candle in hand, came running upstairs. "What is it?" he said. "I sleep just below you and heard a noise as if... Good heavens, there's blood on your shoulder." I stood there, so he told me afterwards, swaying from side to side, white as a sheet, with the mark on my shoulder as if a hand covered with blood had been laid there. "It's in there," I said, pointing. "She, you know, the portrait is in there too, hanging up on the place we took it from." At that he laughed. "My dear fellow, this is mere nightmare," he said. He pushed by me and opened the door, I standing there simply inert with terror, unable to stop him, unable to move. "Whoa, what an awful smell," he said. Then there was silence. He had passed out of my sight behind the open door. Next moment he came out again, as white as myself, and instantly shut it. "Yes," he said, "the portrait's there," he said. "And on the floor is a thing spotted with earth, like what they bury people in. Come on, away, quick, come away." How I got downstairs I hardly know. An awful shuddering and nausea of the spirit rather than of the flesh had seized me, and more than once he had to place my feet upon the steps, while every now and then he cast glances of terror and apprehension up the stairs. But in time we came to his dressing-room on the floor below, and there I told him what I have here described. The sequel can be made short. Indeed, some of my readers have perhaps already guessed what it was, if they remember that inexplicable affair of the churchyard at West Fawley some 8 years ago, where an attempt was made 3 times to bury the body of a certain woman who had committed suicide. On each occasion the coffin was found in the course of a few days again protruding from the ground. After the 3rd attempt, in order that the thing should not be talked about, the body was buried elsewhere in unconsecrated ground. Where it was buried was just outside the iron gate of the garden belonging to the house where this woman had lived. She had committed suicide in a room at the top of the tower in that house. Her name was Julia Stone. Subsequently, the body was again secretly dug up, and the coffin was found to be full of blood. It's been fantastic having you along for our live stream this evening. It's such fun this time of the year. As you can tell, we have a lovely time ourselves. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. You can find us on all the normal platforms, of course. Visit our website, thecotswoldexplorer.co.uk, where you will find details of all the other stuff we've done.